everybody. We're going to read the article, Remember the Maine, to Hell with Spain today, about the Spanish-American War. Here's a picture of Teddy Roosevelt there, leading the Rough Riders. While you are listening to me, then you're going to fill out this reading guide that is in our Google Classroom about Spanish-American War Notes and Reading Guide. There's parts of it that we'll fill out together, but most of it will be right in this reading. All right, let's get started. I'll X myself out. Okay, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. How the United States emerged from the Spanish-American War as a true global power. On the night of February 15, 1898, as most of the men aboard the USS Maine were asleep in their bunks, a huge explosion ripped apart the steel hull of the American warship and sent it to the bottom of the harbor in Havana, Cuba. Even today, 115 years later, it's not clear what caused the explosion that killed 266 sailors and Marines. But there is no doubt that the sinking of the Maine contributed mightily to the start of the Spanish-American War 2 months later. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain became a popular slogan that, combined with sensationalized newspaper reporting, stirred resentment against the fading Spanish Empire and built fervor for establishing an American empire around the world. Although the fighting lasted just 10 weeks and wasn't much of a military contest, the Spanish-American War is a pivotal moment in U.S. history, signaling the emergence of the United States as a global power and ushering what came to be known as the American century. It's a turning point that marks the first time American expansion goes overseas, says Louis A. Perez Jr., a professor. And here is a political cartoon where America is cutting down the final Spanish-American colonies and taking them from Spain. And the chips of wood say Puerto Rico and Cuba. So a professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and the author of War of 1898. Perez says the Spanish-American War triggered an intense debate in the U.S. about what some saw as the contradiction between American democracy and intervention in the affairs of other countries. More than a century later, we're still debating America's role in the world and whether or not the U.S. should serve as the world's police officer. So here's a map of the locations and the players in the war. So it's U.S. and Spain. And the places where we fought were Cuba, right here. Puerto Rico is a territory that the U.S. Gets after the war. And then the Philippines is where there was another battle, and that's a territory that we get from the war as well. So it's against the U.S. and Spain, but it was not fought in either one of our countries. The causes of the war. So this is right here now, the causes of the war. There is still no definitive answer to what caused the explosion that sank the Maine, but many Americans in 1898 were convinced that Spain was responsible. While tensions had been building for some time between the two countries, there had been no outright conflicts between them. The cause of much of the antagonism was the situation in Cuba, one of Spain's oldest colonies claimed by Christopher Columbus on his voyage in 1492. The Cubans began an unsuccessful 10-year revolt in 1868 against Spanish rule. When another rebellion erupted in 1895, Spain sent a new military leader whose harsh treatment of the Cuban people was reported in gory detail in American newspapers like the New York Journal and the New York World. The sensationalized stories from Cuba were examples of what came to be known as yellow journalism. And we'll talk about that in class. Americans sympathized with Cuba's struggle for independence, which many felt resembled America's own fight for freedom against the British more than a century earlier. There was another reason, so it's our second one, for the intense interest in Cuba. Every U.S. president since John Quincy Adams had worried that Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, could become a strategic threat if it fell into the wrong hands. Spain's continued presence there was a glaring exception to the Monroe Doctrine. and that was a policy introduced by President James Monroe in 1823 that said that the U.S. would step in if a European power interfered in the affairs of North or South America. By 1898, the Spanish Empire, that had once included territory on 5 continents from Africa to the coast of North America, had been reduced just to Cuba, Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, and the Spanish Sahara, and a few islands in the Atlantic and Pacific, and the Philippines. Filipinos, like the Cubans, were fighting for independence. As resentment against Spain intensified, President William McKinley, 1897 to 1901, initially rejected the idea of intervening in Cuba. McKinley knew that the U.S. was not prepared for war. Its army was small, and since the Civil War ended in 1865, it had fought only in Indian skirmishes in the West. Still, many felt that the nation already stretching across America, the restless American spirit needed another frontier to conquer. Teddy Roosevelt, who was then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, openly supported the war. "I should welcome almost any war," Roosevelt said, "for I think this country needs one." Under increasing pressure to act, President McKinley had ordered the Maine to Havana to protect the sizable American investments in Cuba's sugar, tobacco, and mining industries. The battleship's sinking provoked greater resentment of Spain. And on April 25, 1898, Congress approved a declaration of war. The first major battle was waged in the Philippines. So here we are at the section that talks about the war. The first major battle was waged in the Philippines, where Commodore George Dewey led American naval forces against Spain's aging Pacific fleet in Manila Bay. Dewey destroyed most of the slower, wooden-hulled Spanish ships in just 6 hours. Dewey's victory energized America as it prepared to send troops to Cuba. Worried about yellow fever, the Army believed that blacks, because of their roots in countries with warm climates, had a natural immunity to the mosquito-borne disease. It recruited large numbers of African Americans, calling them immunes. Some Americans were so eager to fight that they couldn't wait to join the regular army, which required several months of training. Theodore Roosevelt resigned from the Navy and organized a group that included college students, Southwestern cowboys, and ranchers, many of whom already knew how to shoot rifles and ride horses, and he called them the Rough Riders. Spain had the disadvantage of trying to fight a war from across the Atlantic, while the U.S. could send troops from Florida to Cuba in a day. American Marines stormed Guantanamo Bay on the eastern shore of Cuba in June. That established a U.S. presence that continues today. We have a base in Guantanamo. While the main invasion force landed about 20 miles east of Santiago, Cuba's second largest city. Roosevelt led the Rough Riders in an attack against dug-in Spanish troops outside Santiago. The scene was painted by American artist Frederick Remington. Although not quite accurately, Roosevelt and his volunteers didn't charge up San Juan Hill as Remington depicted, but up nearby Kettle Hill. They later joined the troops that had already engaged the Spanish at San Juan. It mattered little. Roosevelt's reputation as a war hero was established, and after the war, when McKinley ran for re-election, he chose Roosevelt as his running mate, and when McKinley was assassinated in 1901, Roosevelt became president. Following decisive defeats in Santiago and the Philippines, Spain surrendered already on July 17. Peace talks in Paris in December led to the final dissolution of the old empire. Spain granted Cuba its independence. It ceded or gave the islands of Puerto Rico in the Caribbean and Guam in the Pacific to the U.S., and it sold the Philippines to the U.S. for $25 million. The leader of the Filipino insurgents, so the rebels who fought back against the Spanish, Emilio Aguinaldo, initially welcomed the Americans as liberators, but when the U.S. kept control of the nation, Aguinaldo began attacking American troops. The insurgents were defeated after 3 years, but the war cost the lives of 4,000 Americans and set off a ferocious debate at home about American imperialism. The U.S. didn't grant the Philippines independence until after World War II. Although Cuba won its independence from Spain in 1898, American troops remained there until 1902. After withdrawing, the U.S. still claimed the right to intervene in Cuban affairs if the country got into financial or political difficulty. Brief though it was, the Spanish-American War had lasting repercussions. So there's the war, the end of the war. We just covered that with the Treaty of Paris. Lasting repercussions we're at. In a letter to Roosevelt, Secretary of State John Hay referred to it as a splendid little war. The easy victory over Spain forced European powers to take seriously America's threats to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. President Roosevelt then took steps that made the Monroe Doctrine even more far-reaching. Here is a timeline of our major U.S. wars after 1898. So next we're heading to World War I. We'll cover World War II, and then in the 50s, the Korean War, and then the Vietnam War. And then Panama, the Persian Gulf, Bosnia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. So the extension of the Monroe Doctrine, known as the Roosevelt Corollary, the new policy put all the nations of North, South, and Central America on notice that the U.S. would intervene in any country that showed chronic wrongdoing, that might make it possible for a European power to take over. So that meant the U.S. was going to be the police of the entire Western Hemisphere. So we had to have a military to match that promise. So now we're on the end. Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Many Americans opposed the idea of the U.S. becoming an imperial power. Anti-imperialists believed that controlling overseas colonies contradicted America's traditional policy of non-intervention in world affairs and would lead the nation into endless conflicts. Many scholars see parallels between what happened in the wake of the Spanish-American War and more recent American interventions abroad, from Vietnam to Iraq and Afghanistan. In some cases, American troops sent to help settle these conflicts were not welcome with open arms, and it led to long wars that divided America and drained its resources. Here's one of your answers: when American troops are not welcomed. The similarities are eerie, says Perez, the author and scholar. If you look at some of the texts of anti-imperialists, people who were against taking over other countries, and their speeches, you would think that they're talking about Iraq and Afghanistan, not the Philippines and Cuba. The 1898 war also left issues that are unresolved to this day. So this is another one. The fate of Puerto Rico's status, for example, was the subject of a non-binding referendum in November. A majority of Puerto Ricans favored changing the island's status from a U.S. Commonwealth to the 51st state. This is an older article, but it's a times past one, so it fits. But Puerto Rico frequently votes on whether or not they would like to request to become a U.S. state. Then there's Cuba, whose relationship with the U.S. has been troubled since 1898. For decades after the war, Washington supported Cuban dictators whose corruption and ruthlessness stoked resentment against the U.S. that Fidel Castro used to gain his support for his rebel movement in the 50s. In 1961, 2 years after Castro seized control of Cuba and began to align it with the communist Soviet Union, he ordered the alteration of a soaring monument to the victims of the Maine that had been erected on the Havana waterfront in 1926. Busts of President McKinley and Roosevelt were chiseled out, and a bronze American eagle was removed. Castro added a new bronze plaque that summed up the resentment still felt by some Cubans about the Spanish-American War. And in Spanish, the inscription reads, "To the victims of the Maine, who were sacrificed by the voracity of the imperialists and their desire to gain control of the island of Cuba, February 1898 to February 61. All right, so that's the end of our reading. Hopefully you're able to get all the way to the end, what happens when we're not welcomed, and then true, false, there's some unresolved issues today.